Hello and welcome to my channel. In this episode, I'll explain what's being said during our flight, the communication with ATC, air traffic control. Before we dive into it, a little bit of a basic information. We use two separate radios, COM1 and COM2. That means we can listen to two radios at the same time, however we can transmit on only one. We transmit on a button which is actually on the floor. So you do not see me pushing a button, it's actually done with my foot. I press on the floor on a button and that opens the mic. Now before we start, we use a call sign as it's called. So every time I call on the radio, I use a name, in this case Bluebell 15 Alpha, which is our call sign. And a call sign is different than a registration. The registration is seen on the side of the helicopter or airplane. However, commercial operators, basically bigger airplanes, bigger helicopters, they use call signs and not just their registration. You see me typing in our call sign in the FMS, abbreviated BBX15 Alpha. And every call you'll hear that call sign. So ATC knows it's me.
0510. Expect ILS approach. Runway 21.
Next, we tune the radios. On COM number 1, I type in the frequency for the weather report, which is automatic generated. And on COM 2 is the ground frequency for startup clearance later on. I'll listen to the ATIS, and once I've received the ATIS, I'll call for startup clearance.
Scattered at 2,500 feet, broken at 3,000 feet. Temperature 17, 2.16, QNH 1011.
At this stage, we have received the weather information Bravo with the QNH of 1011. That's the hectopascal setting that we'll be setting in our altimeters. However, if ATC comes back with a different one, we'll be using that one. Now it's time to call for our startup clearance. We've done all our checks and the helicopter is basically ready for startup. However, because we operate in a controlled environment, we need permission to start the rotor or the engines. And you'll hear me starting with our call sign only. This is called an initial call. So ground, Bluebell 15 Alpha. Then we wait for the response, and when they are ready, we give our message with the request.
Ground, good morning, Bluebell 15 Alpha.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, ground, goedemorgen.
Stop number 9, to board, request start. First stop is the request for Charlie via Lergo. We have information Bravo.
So I've asked for the startup. I've given him the information that we received information Bravo. We have 2 on board, or 2 POB, persons on board. And I've asked the departure, Lergo 3 Mike, as you can see on the plate.
15, copy 2, startup approved for the runway 21, QNH 1012.
Start approved, 1012, Bluebell 15 Alpha.
Alright, so our startup is approved. QNH is 1012, which is different than the weather report. That's why I read it back, and that's the one we'll be using in the altimeter settings. We do not have our departure clearance yet, only the approval for the start. The clearance is on request, so that means ground is issuing it to a system, and this usually takes a couple of minutes before it's ready for delivery. And once we have started up, I'll ask him ready for the clearance.
Ground, Bluebell 15 Alpha is ready for the clearance.
Bluebell 15 Alpha cleared, Lergo 3 Mike 2000 feet, school 4315.
Lergo 3 Mike 2000 4315, Bluebell 15 Alpha.
The clearance that we receive is Lergo 3 Mike, altitude 2000 feet, and then a number, squawk 4315. A squawk code is the code that we put in our transponder and is visible for air traffic control on the radar screen.
15 Alpha correct, full to tower, and we'll fly to right.
16 tower, dankjewel, 15.
The ground controller informs me that the readback is correct. He just told me readback is correct, when ready, contact tower. That means the clearance that I have received is corresponding with the clearance that he has issued, and the next message is contact tower. That means I can switch to the tower frequency, and when I'm ready for departure or taxiing, I'll call tower.
Tower, morning, Bluebell 15 Alpha, spot 9, request taxi, and we need a minute.
Here I have asked for the taxi clearance. Bluebell 15, spot number 9, that's our parking position. Ready for taxi, that means we are ready for taxi. And we need a minute. Now, that means we need some extra time once we have reached the holding point just before the runway or on the runway, because it's the first flight of the day, and that means we need to perform a power check, which is a check on the engines to ensure we have enough and sufficient power as certified by the RFM, the Rotorcraft Flight Manual.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, decoy, goedemorgen. Taxi holding point Delta 3, runway 21.
Morning, Delta 3 to 1, Bluebell 15 Alpha.
Here we received our taxi clearance, which is Delta 3 for the runway 21. In this plate you see the routing, basically straight ahead from our parking position to Delta 3, holding point for the runway.
15 Alpha, the wind 1908, knots maximum 2, runway 21, line of weight, report ready.
Line point, runway 21, call you ready, Bluebell 15 Alpha.
Here we got our approval to line up on the runway and report ready. Now we line up here on the runway, and I have to read that back to him. And that means we do not have a clearance to depart, so we cannot just take off here. We are only allowed to drive, basically taxi on the runway and report to the tower that when we are ready for our departure. We never say ready for takeoff, we say ready for departure. Takeoff is a word that's only used in combination with a clearance.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, runway 21, ready.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, wind 1908, knots maximum 2, runway 21, clear takeoff.
Clear takeoff 21, Bluebell 15 Alpha.
Here we have received our takeoff clearance. I've informed tower that we are ready for departure and on which runway we are, runway 21. Tower comes back to me and informs me of the wind, 190, which is the direction, and then he makes sure I'm on the correct runway, runway 21, cleared for takeoff. I have to read back the clearances because that's very important.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, for further contact arrival 12423, goeie vlucht tot straks.
Arrival, later, 15 Alpha.
At this stage, we are climbing away from the airport and we are about to enter the TMA. A TMA is the area which is further away from the airport, which is controlled by a arrival or departure controller. That's a radar operator, not actually sitting in a tower. He's not looking outside, he is only looking at a radar screen. And tower gives us the handover. So he informs us and tells us contact arrival and the frequency where we need to go to.
Arrival, morning, Bluebell 15 Alpha 800, climb 2000, and let go 3 Mike.
At this stage, I have made my call to arrival or checked in at arrival with our call sign and our routing that we are following with the level we are designated to climb to.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, arrival, good morning. Identified Quebec for Charlie, your first destination?
Morning, identified AFR MCC for Charlie 15 Alpha.
Coasting out, direct approved.
Coasting out direct, thank you, Bluebell 15 Alpha.
The arrival controller has identified us. That means the code that I have typed in the transponder, 4315, is visible on the screen and we are flying the correct routing. So we are identified, but this controller is anticipating because he knows more or less our route and our first destination. He confirms if our first destination indeed is the Quebec for Charlie, which is slightly off from the intended route. And he gives us a direct. That means after coasting out, we are allowed to fly direct to our destination. So I thank him and say direct. At this stage, we are checking in at our offshore frequency. ATC or air traffic control is already done. We are cruising now inside the TMA and arrival frequency is being checked in. And now I talk to the offshore frequency, which is not a controller. It's not a ATC controller as such, but it's an operations information radio station, which is dealing with all the traffic offshore. So this is on the other frequency, on the COM number 1, and the other frequency of arrival is still open. So if ATC calls me, I can still hear it. So that's why we have 2 radios. In this case, I'll be checking in on the offshore frequency, inform him about our endurance, possible intended routes, persons on board, and the ETA or estimated time of arrival to our first destination. And then I'll ask him for the flight watch. Flight watch is basically an extra pair of eyes who is following us on a separate screen, which is done by the offshore radio operator. He is aware of our route, our endurance, and in case he loses communication or if there is anything, he will inform or alert ATC as well.
Lincoln, goedemorgen, Bluebell 15 Alpha.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, goedemorgen, welkom.
Morgen, 15, 2000 feet, 2 on board, 2000 units. First stop is the Quebec 4 Charlie, ETA is 37. Can you take the flight watch?
Bluebell 15 Alpha, access, ja, met z'n tweetjes, 2 uur endurance, en ETA Quebec 4 Charlie, minuut 37, 37, and I have the flight watch, welkom.
Flight watch, thank you, 15 Alpha.
You can hear some of it is in Dutch because this is not standard phraseology as such that is mandatory to follow. However, the important items he read back in English, our endurance and the ETA, and that he confirms he has the flight watch.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, no options for early descent. The QNH North Sea South 1012 as well. And over to Amsterdam, 128.5, 5 vlucht.
North Sea South 1012, early descent is approved. Switching Amsterdam 128.5, dankjewel. Straks Bluebell 15 Alpha.
This is the end of the TMA at Lergo at the red line, and beyond that line you can see our first destination, Echo Hotel, Quebec Hotel, or Quebec 4 Charlie. That's where we'll be heading, and it's very close to this area, and that's why the arrival controller gave us a approval for a early descent. So we've started our descent, and we'll contact Amsterdam for flight information.
Amsterdam, morning, Bluebell 15 Alpha.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, Amsterdam.
Morning, 15, just released by the COI. Descending altitude 5 feet initially. First destination is Quebec 4 Charlie. We have 2 POB. Lincoln has a flight watch. After the Quebec 4 Charlie is the Quebec 1 Delta and then back to the Quebec 4 Charlie.
Yeah, this copy all Bluebell 15 Alpha. Identified the North Sea South QNH is 1012.
1012 for the south, dankjewel. Call you airborne, Bluebell 15.
Good.
Here I've given Amsterdam basically a lot of information because the flight to be conducted is very close to the TMA and only a brief period into Amsterdam area. I've just given him the route and that we will be operating between 3 helidecks, Quebec 4 Charlie, Quebec 1 Delta, back to the Quebec 4 Charlie at low level, and once we are airborne, I'll give him a call again. This is information, this is not a controller.
15 Alpha, latest wind 20017 knots, might be variating between the 180 and the 210.
Let's go, thank you, 15.
The radio operator offshore has just given us the wind information. That is handy for us for landing offshore. We always make our approach into wind. Now, before we land on a helideck offshore, we need to make sure that it is ready to receive us. And that is done with communication towards the HLO, Helideck Landing Officer. He is in charge of the helideck, make sure that the positions are in place with the fire guards. There are no obstacles on the helideck. Basically, the helideck is prepared for a helicopter operation. And we confirm that by asking him for a clear deck.
Quebec 4 Charlie, hello, good morning, Bluebell 15 Alpha. 2 minutes out for the clearance, please.
Good morning, 15 Alpha. Clear deck on the Quebec Charlie.
Clear deck, Quebec 4 Charlie, thank you, 15 Alpha.
So the HLO has given us a deck clearance to land on the Quebec 4 Charlie.
Bluebell 15 Alpha is on the Quebec 4 Charlie, 39.
15 Alpha, minute 399.
Here we just give a landing call, which is the time that we actually landed and that we are on deck on the destination, the Quebec 4 Charlie. At this point, the passengers have disembarked, we have received new passengers, and we've performed all the checks offshore, and we are ready to depart. Before we depart, I make a call to the offshore frequency, not only for the radio operator that he knows that we are departing with how many persons on board, but also any other helicopters that are on this frequency operating in the North Sea, they hear us as well. So it's for general information and situational awareness for the other helicopters as well.
Bluebell 15 Alpha lifting crew only. Quebec 4 Charlie, climbing 2,000 feet, inbound Den Helder. ETA below.
Alright, go ahead. And we have the 102.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, minute 06, only on your way to the Helder. The ETA was level.
At this point, we have departed from the offshore location, the helideck. We are climbing out, inbound our destination, Den Helder. At this point, we contact Amsterdam Information. And since it's so close to the TMA, I already asked him to switch over to the COI arrival. The reason is we need an entry clearance to get into the TMA, because that's controlled area.
Goedemorgen, Bluebell 15 Alpha.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, Amsterdam.
Ja, goedemorgen weer, airborne, Quebec 4 Charlie 800. Crew only, 2 board. Climb altitude 2,000 feet, inbounds the Koi. ETA for the Koi is time 18.
Yeah, it's copy Bluebell 15 Alpha identified. My QNH 1012, but you may contact the Koi arrival for the entry clearance. Bye-bye.
12, switching the Koi, thank you, 15.
So, Amsterdam has given us the QNH, the latest pressure setting for the altimeters in this area, and he advises us to contact arrival straight away because we are so close to the TMA. We'll contact arrival and ask for the entry clearance.
Arrival, morning, Bluebell 15 Alpha.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, arrival, good morning.
Morning, just airborne, for Charlie, passing 1,000 feet, to board, climbing, if possible, non-standard altitude 2,000 feet, inbound Lergo, ETA Lergo time 10, request entry clearance, Bluebell 15 Alpha.
Now, as you hear, there's quite a bit of information in this message. I have asked arrival controller to level off non-standard altitude 2,000 feet. Reason for it is all the inbound traffic is standard flying at 3,000 feet for separation. However, since we are so close to shore, I've asked to level off at altitude 2,000 feet. Also because my intended routing will be a visual approach since it is very nice weather. So I've asked him to level off non-standard altitude 2,000 feet and ask for the arrival clearance via Lergo, which is the entry point.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, Lergo to hotel, non-standard 2,000 feet, runway 21.
Lergo to hotel, non-standard 2,000 feet for the runway 21, and we'll stay with you, Bluebell 15 Alpha. We have 2 POB after Lergo request official, Bluebell 15.
Bluebell 15, 2 PB is copied, identified, QNH 1012.
12, identified, 15.
And Boss 5, report visual mics on the field.
Yeah, Koyo official is Mike Dunfield, Bluebell 15.
At this point, the arrival controller has given us the entry clearance, non-standard 2,000 feet, as I have requested. He also gave us the QNH 1012, which is the pressure setting for the altimeters, and he has asked us report visual with Mike Hotel and the field. One of the requirements for a visual approach is that I have to be visual with the field and the landmarks around it before the controller can give us the clearance for a visual approach. That's why that is of vital importance for me to report when I'm visual with the field.
We are 2,000 leveling.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, initially inbound Bureau, traffic will depart, runway track 3,000.
This is inbound Bureau, Bluebell 15 Alpha, that's covered. And we are already visual with Mike and Hotel and the field, 15.
5 is copied, stand by short for the visual.
Standing by, 15.
Here the arrival controller came back to us and gave us a new point to fly direct to, Bureau, which is a reporting point in the northern part of the area. And that is due to other traffic departing and climbing from the aerodrome to their cruising level. I have given the information that I'm actually visual with Mike Hotel and the field. So at that point he could give me a clearance for a visual approach, but since he is not completely sure about the separation yet, he gives me standby for the clearance.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, cleared visual, Mike Hotel.
Cleared visual, Mike Hotel, Bluebell 15 Alpha.
At this point, we received our clearance for the visual approach via Mike and Hotel. We always have to read back clearances, that's very important. So at this point, we fly basically on visual reference direct to Mike Hotel and our destination, the field.
Delta 0553. Expect ILS approach. Runway 21 for arrival and departure. Runway condition dry. Transition level is 45.
Right heading
Wind 200 degrees.
Even though we have very nice weather and we know we already have the field in sight, it's still good habit to listen to the ATC. So at this point I have tuned in the ATC on the number 1 because that's not the vital frequency as of this moment to monitor, and open up the frequency to listen to the ATC.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, contact tower 1213, fijne dag.
Station Tower, 03, bedankt, 15 Alpha.
While listening to the ATC frequency on the number 1 radio, the number 2 radio, which was arrival controller, came back to me and said I had to contact the Koi tower.
Tower, good morning, Bluebell 15 Alpha, level 2000, inbound Mike.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, the Koi, good morning again. Report passing hotel 1,000 feet on the QNH 1012.
Koi passing hotel 1,000 feet on 1012, Bluebell 15 Alpha.
Here the tower controller gave us the next reporting point, which is hotel on our intended route, however at 1,000 feet. We are at 2,000, so we are descending now 1,000 feet and report once we are passing hotel at 1,000 feet.
Bluebell 15 Alpha, hotel 1,000.
Bluebell 15, number 1, wind 2001 knots.
Number 1 for the 12, roger, Bluebell 15 Alpha.
I've given him the report at hotel, 1000 feet, and the tower controller came back to me with runway 21, you're number 1. That means the runway 21 is the designated runway we'll be landing on, and number 1 means that we are the first ones aligned for the runway, and by giving us the number 1, it gives us the approval to actually descend and position ourselves for final for the runway.
571, Cleveland, 1, Bluebell, 15 Alpha.
Now we have received our landing clearance, which is very important, and we need to read it back, obviously. There's a lot of criteria involved for an ATC controller to give a clearance.
Blue 15, text approved. Text approved, Bluebell, 15 Alpha.
And this is the last call, basically, that ATC gives us. Once we've landed on the runway, we get the taxi approval. That means we can taxi into our parking position. All right, that was it on this information regarding air traffic control communication. This was only related to ATC. If you want to know more about communication in the cockpit between the crew or the MCC, the multi-crew operation, let me know in the comments and I might do a video on that separately in a later stage. For now, thank you very much for watching and see you next time.